good afternoon, good evening, good people from all around the world. And I can still see numbers pouring in as more people join in and attend. First of all, thank you for taking time out of your day to take part in this, the second Meeting of Minds event, following on from the huge success that last month proved to be. It's a real privilege and a pleasure to be here with you again today. I hope you're all keeping well. For those of you who don't know, my name is Dr. Colin Robertson, and I'm a scientific research specialist here at Zinzino. And I've been in position now for just over 6 months. And today's event is actually quite personally special for me, because one of the things that really encouraged me towards wanting to join this team and be a part of this movement was the person who we're going to listen to, who I'm going to have the privilege of speaking to today, and that is the inimitable Dr. Paul Clayton, who I will introduce more formally in a moment. You know, knowing that somebody of Paul's caliber was involved in what happened at Zinzino was a huge encouragement for me, as somebody who was stepping in from a far more traditional scholarly academic background when it came to science and research, and knowing what the focus was and what the ambition was and how that was going to happen. Right now in the world, we know plenty of people have an opinion on health, and plenty of people have an opinion on nutrition. Sadly, not very many of them have an informed opinion on nutrition and health. But the person that we're going to speak to and who we're going to listen to today has an abundance of expertise, knowledge, understanding, years worth of dedicated work within this space. And therefore, everything he has to say is very much something that's worth listening to. Now, again, just before I introduce Paul, I'm going to lay something straight from the start. This is to be a discussion that's going to be led by Paul, and I will welcome your questions, and I will do my best to go into the chat, pick up on those questions and pose some of those to Paul as we go through. And I'll try and capture as many as I possibly can. It's important to note, though, from the start that very typically to research and science, and what I believe is a real strength and asset to what we do at Zinzino, as much as I respect profoundly Paul and his insights, his knowledge and understanding, we don't always agree, not on every detail. But I assure you that's a good thing. That's something that should reassure you, because that is, in fact, how the best science and research is done. And I would argue that that's how the best decisions are arrived at, particularly when we're as focused as we are as improving global health. Now, all of you have taken time out, and you're probably very much frontline workers who are dealing with this, having more intimate conversations on a daily basis with the people whose behavior you're looking to change. And so it's important to us that you have accurate, evidence-based, research-informed information, so that it's reliable, so that it actually has substance and that it's meaning. And I'm sure that that's actually what you've all arrived here for, is nothing less than that. Well, we're guaranteed to receive just that, with a background that is extensive, a specialist within this area, and I would say the pioneer of pharmaconutrition. I would like to welcome now to the screen, again, the inimitable Dr. Paul Clayton. If you could join us, Paul, that would be fantastic.
All present and correct.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thanks, for taking time out and taking part in this day. It's appreciated personally, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of everybody who's tuned in and tuning in. That's great to have you here with us, Paul. So if you don't mind, just to set us up, because I know there's a formality to this and there is some information that you'd like to share. But I think really if we could start more, if you don't mind, Paul, from a conversational point of view. And first of all, can you just kind of give us an insight to what it is you'd like us to talk about today?
One of the most senior people working in health and nutrition in the world today, and who's been really instrumental in setting many of the terms of the current debate, is a man called Barry Popkin. And he's a professor at the University of North Carolina. He was originally an agricultural economist, but he moved sideways and upwards into nutrition and nutritional policy. And starting in 1995, he published the first of an extensive series of papers describing what he called the nutrition transition. And that's really what I want to talk about. Mm-hmm. And what he meant, what this term gradually grew, it expanded to mean the change that we've seen in public health in every country that has left its traditional diet behind and has moved on to the modern and increasingly ultra-processed diet. And what we've seen in every country where this has occurred is a huge increase in the frequency of the non-communicable diseases, right across the board. And at the same time, we have seen a progressive reduction in the latency of these conditions. That is, we've come to see them occurring in progressively younger and younger groups of patients. And this has happened in a very short period of time. Now, I am no more a blip, a footnote in the margins of some obscure history book. But if I go back 50 years to when I was in medical school, actually it's more than 50 years now, I remember being taught that type 2 diabetes was a disease of old age. And in 1968, which is when I went to medical school, it was. And of course, what we are all very much aware of is that now type 2 diabetes has become the most significant pandemic that the world has ever seen, far greater than the COVID, which is trivial, absolutely trivial in comparison. And not only has the frequency of diabetes increased beyond all precedent, beyond all measure, but it's no longer a disease of old age. And so we see type 2 diabetes in patients in their 30s, 20s, teens, even in their preteens. And we've seen falls in the average age of onset of many other types of diseases as well. For example, the neurodegenerative conditions, Alzheimer's and Parkinsonism. So to return to Barry Popkin's work, which is really, as I said, it's helped to set the terms of this debate. I think that he has explained to us that much of what we think of as the natural phenomenology of aging, that is, as we get older, we become more at risk of cancer, heart disease, dementia, and all those sorts of things, is an artifact. That's not actually an essential, an integral part of the aging process at all. These, in fact, are all symptoms of populations that are being chronically poisoned. And I think that the debate was really badly influenced by a group of rather naive scientists who said, well, let's look at life expectancy in 1900 and look where we are today, and it looks as if everything's getting better and better and better. And that sort of distracted people who hadn't looked in detail at the epidemiology and the patterns of morbidity and mortality. If you start at 1900, it sort of looks as if things are getting better. And one of the reasons for that is that 1900 in Britain, anyway, happens to be a low point in life expectancy. But much of the increase in life expectancy that we've seen occurring through most of the 20th century is an artifact, and it's actually caused by reductions in infant mortality. And that's one of the areas where modern medicine has scored one of its most notable victories. Infant mortality is far less than it used to be. If you go back to Victorian England, 1 in 4 children would die before the age of 5, and that brought the figures down. That is, of course, completely different now. And modern medicine played a part in that. Not the most important part. The most important contribution actually comes from engineers and public health specialists who did things like working on sewage and sanitation programs and things like that. And that's actually what caused the first substantial increase in life expectancy. And then along come people like Pasteur and Fleming and Chaim Florey, of course, and you get the introduction of the antibiotics and the immunization programs, which make a relatively small additional contribution. Now, the problem is that, the engineers who put in the sewage farms, the sanitation programs, they were unsung heroes. They weren't particularly glamorous. And public attention focused on, particularly Pasteur, who was a rock star in his time, and then later on Fleming. And we came away with the idea that the way to treat disease, the way to transform society was through these magic bullets. And that was the birth of the pharmaceutical industry, which has led medicine grievously astray for the last 50 years, and I would argue actually for longer than that. So we've been very distracted, and you now have generations of doctors who've come through medical school, as I did, learning nothing other than pharmaceutical pharmacology. So you have this contrast. We've got all these new blockbuster drugs, the new biologicals, each one heralded as an absolute triumph in medicine. But in the background, public health is deteriorating, and it's getting worse and worse and worse because these drugs don't address the underlying problems. There's other conceptual issues here as well, because when you look in detail at conditions like Alzheimer's, Parkinsonism, cancer, they're not really diseases in the classic sense. Nothing to do with Koch's postulates. And the concept of the disease really goes back to the infectious, the communicable diseases. What we're dealing with now are syndromes. And the complexity of the cell, of the brain, for example, is so great that there are hundreds of different ways, maybe thousands, in which you could end up with a group of symptoms, a syndrome that looks like Parkinsonism or cancer. And the idea that you can address this enormous heterogeneous group of patients with a single magic bullet is absolutely absurd. And it is testimony to the persistence of this magic bullet model of thought. And I think medical arrogance. What we have to do is to go back, we've got to get ourselves back to the garden. I'll quote an old hippie phrase. We've got to go back to the food table and address that.
Let me just, if you don't mind, Paul, I want to pick up on a few points because I'm sure it'll represent how, first of all, congratulations, because I think it took you less than 3 minutes to make your first kind of controversial statement where you brought in the parallel between the pandemics. So that's from anyone who's listening, from my experience, that's really good, Paul. That's a marked improvement. But I'm going to deliberately, if you don't mind, Paul, I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate here.
Sure, please do.
I agree with the vast majority of what you've said, I really do. But I want to play a little bit of devil's advocate because it would be reasonable for anybody who's listening to this, watching this, to say, okay, we're painting a very specific and maybe grim state of affairs because medicine seems to have done more than that. That what we see and what people encounter in their daily lives is that much of that medicine works for them. So I think what people are surrounded by, and often this is what causes the conflict, Paul, is that on a day-to-day, if they get a headache, they take some paracetamol, the headache's gone. If they've got something a bit more intense, they take some anti-inflammatories and it's gone, which is very acute symptom management.
Yeah.
So just parking, because I do 100% want to come back to this notion of all these things that are happening in the background. How do we address that? Because the reality of people's existence is they're seeing quite a positive impact from the pharmaceutical area, aren't they?
Well, I would argue that they don't. If you look at the environment here in North America, for example, iatrogenic illness, that is illness caused by medical intervention, is a leading cause of death. The pharmaceutical tools that we use to treat the symptoms of these diseases, we have nothing to address their causes, their underlying causes, are very specific, very expensive, increasingly expensive, and incredibly toxic. The medical profession kills large numbers of patients. Now, we do have the ability to alleviate symptoms. That's really what the pharmaceutical model is all about. But when you think about it, we've had a century of the pharmaceutical industry. We've had enormous numbers of wonderful scientists and technical people involved in the development of this extensive portfolio that we now have of xenomolecules, of pharmaceutical products. And yet, despite this enormous investment of ingenuity, manpower and womanpower and finance, we still have no cures for any of the chronic degenerative non-communicable diseases. Now, that should be enough to tell you that we're aiming our guns in the wrong direction. And I think what Popkin's work, and I'd also like to cite the work of Michael Gervin at the University of California, what the work that they have done has shown really absolutely convincingly that if we want to improve public health, we cannot use drugs to do that. They're too damn toxic. You cannot use them prophylactically. We need to get to the source. the roots of this problem, and they are the modern diet. And that case is strengthened by the fact that we now know what it is in the modern diet that is making us so ill, that is accelerating the aging process, that has reduced our health expectancy, and is now starting to reduce our life expectancy.
And so that takes us directly to the key question that gets asked most commonly, I would say, is what is the key components? What aspect of the modern diet? What's the part we can point at and say that's what's causing this chaos, in your opinion?
I think the idea that Popkin helped to give birth to and has now become very popular is that the modern diet and lifestyle are harming us. And that's reflected in the terminology that we use when we refer to these diseases rather laughably as diseases of civilization. Well, first of all, I see absolutely no evidence they were any more civilized than our great-grandparents were. I'd argue in some ways we are less civilized. But this concept, diseases of civilization, I think it's romantic, it's poetic, there is some substance to it, but it's extraordinarily amorphous. And what we need to do is to develop a more detailed, a more granular understanding of what it is in the modern diet and lifestyle that is so harmful. And we need to do that in order to be able to develop specific antidotes. So what I have done, and I'm not the only one at all, please, I don't want to give that idea. Many others have been trying to do is to identify what it is in the modern diet and lifestyle. You have to look at those two together. That is causing so much harm. And I think what we've done is it's been distilled down to 4 major pathogenic mechanisms. So 4 horsemen, if you will, of the nutritional apocalypse, which is upon us. And I would say that the first of those 4 horsemen, I suppose in these enlightened times, I should refer to him, her as a horse person, is chronic inflammatory stress. And everyone knows about that, or thinks they know about it, because there's a lot of science has gone into this, but it's become a popular concept. It's been in Time, Newsweek, in the women's magazines, radio programs. Chronic inflammation, bad. And that's a part of it, but it's not the only thing. It's actually only one of 4, as I said. And together with the adverse effects of chronic inflammatory stress, which does lead to excessive tissue damage, we have, because we're eating so many ultra-processed foods, so many simple sugars, so much plant oils, so many empty calories, and because our levels of physical activity and therefore our calorific requirements are so low, we're actually disnourished in the sense that we are depleted in many, many vital cofactors. We're low in many of the vitamins, trace elements, a whole range of phytonutrients, some very important fiber types, some essential fatty acids, some conditionally essential amino sugars and amino acids, and a variety of other things as well. And that is called type B malnutrition. So on the one hand, you've got chronic inflammatory stress, which is leading to accelerated tissue destruction through degradation of the extracellular matrix. On the other hand, we are handicapped by this multiple depletion pattern, and our ability to replenish, restore, and renew is degraded, leading to a situation where you are net catabolic. That is, you're losing more tissue over time than you're able to recreate. So over time, there's a net loss of functional healthy tissue. And that, of course, is one of the core elements, the characteristics of chronic degenerative diseases. So those 2 things are bad enough. But then to that, you have to add dysbiosis, disruption to the microbiota, or what many people refer to as the microbiome. And that, again, goes back to the diet. It's because the prebiotic fibers have been progressively removed from our ultra-processed diet, which means that in those countries which are eating a modern diet, you have a microbiota that is predominantly gram-negative, because it's the gram-positive bugs that are able to eat these prebiotic fibers and then produce compounds which are helpful to us. Stop eating the prebiotic fibers, those gram positive species start to thin out, their place is taken by gram-negative species, many of which consume mucin as opposed to prebiotic fiber. So they damage and corrode the mucosal layers that lie over the colonocytes in the large bowel. They come into contact with the colonocytes, and being gram-negative and therefore coated with lipopolysaccharides, you have a hugely pro-inflammatory environment, leading to breakdown of the gut epithelial barrier and what people call leaky gut, and the entrance of macromolecules into the bloodstream where they should not be. So you're getting inflammatory mediators, you're getting endotoxemia because lipopolysaccharide itself is getting into the blood. And this is one reason why, for example, non-alcohol related fatty liver disease now is estimated to affect a quarter of the entire population of the globe, which is astonishing. It's absolutely astounding and really, really serious, because NAFLD will tend to progress through to non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, and these are hugely important risk factors for hepatocellular carcinoma. And the figures for these and the projections for these are absolutely horrendous. I mean, we don't have enough livers to transplant. We don't have enough surgical teams to carry out those transplant surgery. This is an absolutely nightmare scenario. And it's another reason why we have to step away from this pharmaceutical crisis management model and go back to the roots and look at genuinely preventative prophylactic strategies. And as I said, that can only be done by unhorsing these three apocalyptic figures and restoring pre-transitional nutritional values. Now, there's one more horse person, I beg your pardon. And that is this mismatch between the excessive glycemic load of the modern diet and our insufficiently physically active lifestyles. And we're physically very inactive thanks to information technology and the internal combustion engine. And our levels of physical activity are probably a third, maybe 40% less than they were 2 or 3 generations ago. And what that means is we're pouring a lot of glucose into the bloodstream, and you're not abstracting it, because skeletal muscle and muscular activity is far more important as a glucose sink than the liver is. And this is another reason why you're getting so much NAFLD, because so much sugar is pouring in and we're not taking enough of it out into the skeletal muscle. You're upregulating lipogenesis in the liver, which is one of the factors that drives NAFLD. So this situation also creates hyperglycemia, hyperinsulinemia, and you move towards metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and then a whole raft of complications that spins off from that. These 4 pathogenic mechanisms are enough, more than enough, to explain why the non-communicable diseases are spinning out of control, why health expectancy is in free fall, and why life expectancy is now starting to fall in those countries which have the highest consumption of ultra-processed foods. And I'm talking about North America, the United Kingdom, Australia comes in next, and then a group of other countries coming up fast behind.
Well, yeah, I mean, that stacks up true. Something you just said, though, just reminded me, because the first instance of type 2 diabetes amongst children in the UK was 2002. And at that time, I was still working in a clinical role at a big district general hospital. And I remember the shockwaves that sent.
Yes.
That made news.
I remember it too.
Yeah, I remember it too. A child. Now, you just made reference to, NAFLD and the shock, but we don't get shocked anymore. We're nearly 20 years past that initial diagnosis. Diagnoses have gone exponentially over that period of time, where we are, for no pun intended, but we're immune to being shocked. We've normalized this sickness. And my concern is, Paul, is that we will just normalize the next wave and the next wave, that as the temperature increases, we just can't, it no longer makes any impact on us. We just accept it for what it is, which is kind of what you're touching upon now. But what I'm going to go back to really is, again, one of the common questions is, okay, then everything you're saying makes complete sense. The data and the information there is to back up the sentiment. Why don't we all just go back to eating as we did 90 years ago? And that will fix it.
It would fix a great deal of it. But I think there's a problem here. We're very time poor and increasingly thanks to the absolute and utter ineptitude of our political classes, we've all been hit economically as well. And unfortunately, given the way in which the food industry has successfully lobbied the government to subsidize certain areas of agricultural production and not others, we're in this odd situation where these ultra-processed foods are really cheap. They're artificially cheap. They're heavily marketed. They have long shelf lives. They taste absolutely delicious because bliss point technology has been used to make them effectively addictive. And so these foods are available, they're widely available, they're promoted, they're being sold to kids who want them. The kids develop a sweet tooth, they develop a craving for those kinds of things. And what we now know is that if you eat these types of foods, they actually cause a kind of a brain damage, which is at least initially irreversible, but subsequently probably irreversible, which actually destroys and damages and degrades your own appetites and food preferences, leading you to consume more junk foods. I mean, these foods are incredibly toxic. And they damage us not only in terms of increasing our incidence of cardiovascular disease, cancers, neurodegenerative conditions, but they also damage the working brain. They damage the workings of the brain in a way that reduces impulse control, that is demotivational, that tends to push you towards anxiety and depression, that damages your relationship to food. So this is a very vicious circle. And I would argue that the multinational food companies, food manufacturing companies, are actually involved in a kind of slow motion genocide. They are responsible for an enormous burden of ill health and premature death. And this is not just me saying this. This has been broken down by, the governmental organizations which do this very huge, enormous scale data crunching. And they say unequivocally that the most important cause of early death, which means preventable death worldwide, is disnutrition. Not starvation, which it once used to be, but it's overnutrition and disnutrition. So this is a huge ongoing problem, and the food multinationals they're wading knee deep in blood. The problem is they have become, they're almost invisible. With tobacco, we had a couple of brave pioneering surgeons general in the United States who looked at the data and said, well, it's tobacco that causes these particular types of problems. And that was relatively easy because you had smokers and non-smokers. Today, it's very hard to find people who don't eat the modern diet. You can do it. You can do it. And this is where I'd like to bring in Michael Gervin. And he is a very interesting scientist with a phenomenal list of publications behind him. And he's the professor of evolutionary anthropology and biodemography at the University of California. And one of his specialities is the study of contemporary hunter-gatherer groups. And they're a kind of a contemporary blue zone. My own field of research has been in the blue zones of the 19th century, as you know. And Michael Gervin has come to very similar conclusions as to the findings that I was instrumental, or I played a role in bringing into the public. What he finds is that in these hunter-gatherer societies, life expectancy is well into the 70s, but they have very little degenerative disease. Very little. They tend to die of infection and trauma in the main. There is a very small number who will develop the types of diseases that are so important for us, but the numbers are very, very small, about 10% of the numbers that we see in our society. And that matches almost perfectly our findings in the 19th century blue zone of the mid-Victorian period. So we don't have to do very much to get back to where we should be. If you look at it from this perspective, the triumph of the pharmaceutical industry and the medical profession for the last 150 years has been to create the cancer of pharmaceutical industry and medical profession that exists today. That's the biggest and the best thing that they've done. They have created a very good living for themselves to compensate for this toxic wasteland that the food industry has thrown us into.
There's a lot of very powerful comments in there, Paul, and very provocative comments, which people will have listened expecting to hear from yourself. I think it's important that we kind of just calm the seas a little bit. I appreciate and respect your opinion on these things, but I think it's important that we calm the seas a little bit on this. There's a lot of what you've said I agree with, and I think also when we look at the health cycles that we've seen that of countries and even city regions that have emerged quite rapidly. We saw this with Japan. We've seen this with certain regions in China, whereby they inherit our kind of food behavior and how rapidly their health profiles start to replicate what we have over here. So I think
for them, it's a nightmare, an absolute nightmare. We've seen that in India in a spectacular fashion, in China as well. And I think there are reasons for that. The so-called thrifty genome may be more expressed in those populations, and they may therefore be more vulnerable. The emerging public health problems certainly seem to suggest that.
I think if we diffuse the notion of any intention, and we just go back to the notion of cause and effect, there is a clear case to be made. One of the arguments I put forward at every kind of medical clinical conference I attend is that despite our advances clinically, medically, and scientifically over the past 70 years, all of our health indicators have gotten worse. So that in itself presents a picture that we all need to take a stark look at, and we need to address.
Absolutely, Colin, but can I just jump in here? I'm not talking about intention. I'm not talking about intention at all. The scenario that I'm describing, I don't think it's not some vast conspiracy. It's some, I'm not even sure that it could be described as a collusion. Everyone is busy doing their thing, working in their silos. The food companies just want to sell more. They want to compete in their space. The pharmaceutical industries see problems that they want to solve. But I think that everybody's off target.
Yeah. What we have that, I would entirely agree. I certainly would. I know we're going to hand over to you, that there are some slides that you'd like to share in a moment. There's been a few questions coming through. So before I hand over to you entirely, if I can just have a quick look, I've tried to pick up some that have come through that I feel we can address given this time now. Let's have a look. There's some that are very product related. With all due respect to everybody that's on it, it's really hard, given the nature of this form, and for either of us to go into really specific product ones and what they may or may not do in certain kind of specific conditions. There are other types of events and forums that we host for that. So I think a lot of the other things, from what I can see and understanding what it is you're about to talk about, you may well cover next, Paul. So what I'm going to do is I'll return to the questions, but I will hand over to you to share your slides and take this conversation where we're headed next. Thank you.
Well, in that case, let me share the screen, and I'm going to recapitulate some of the points that I made and perhaps develop some of them a little bit further. I will say just one thing. You've heard me being very critical of modern ultra-processed foods, and the generation of ultra-processed foods that is available to us at the moment is very, very unhealthy. I would, in fact, I do regard them as toxic. But ultra-processed foods don't have to be. If they were formulated properly, they could not only be delicious, but they could actually be health promoting. And some of the changes that would need to be made in order to do that are relatively small. And all I want to say is, before we start getting into the slides, is that I do talk quite frequently to people who are involved in the flavor industry and the food industry, and there are increasingly people there who are beginning to think, well, maybe we can do something. Maybe we can change these formulations in a way that would make them less destructive and more pro-health, because these are not all sociopaths. These are people who I think are beginning to understand, oh, we have a heavy responsibility here. And the food industry, I would say, has been guilty of privatizing its profits and socializing these enormous costs which we have to bear. And the pharmaceutical industry and this food industry have this very unhealthy symbiotic relationship. The food industry is making huge numbers of people ill, chronically ill, so that they need chronic medication, which the pharmaceutical industry says, oh, thank you very much, that's a wonderful market for us. And then they treat these conditions with drugs which only treat the symptoms, do not cure them. Those patients become cash cows for the rest of their increasingly constricted lives. And so I see the general public as being caught in a trap, or being crushed between two millstones. On the one hand, they're being made chronically ill by the food industry, and then they're chronically poisoned, managed but chronically poisoned by the pharmaceutical industry. It's a prison with two walls. And what I say to anyone who's interested in this area is that it's a prison you can very easily escape from. And the most simple way of doing this is by saying to yourself, well, I'm not going to buy these ultra-processed foods anymore. I'm going to learn how to cook with basic produce. And when you do that, immediately, this whole environment changes. With one bound, you are free. And you're free to explore the green fields of a much better health prospect. Mm. And I'm going to recapture that in the slides as well, if I may. Can I go there now?
Brilliant. Hand over to you, Paul. Brilliant. Thank you.
All right. Well, let's see. I'm not quite sure if this is going to work. So let me just bring this up full screen. Okay, so the nutrition transition then, and let me just say before I really get into this, that if we were still eating a pre-transitional diet, I would be irrelevant. Zinzino wouldn't be necessary. You wouldn't be needing to take supplements. We're simply a response. What we're trying to do is to provide the antidotes to this nutrition transition. And I regard that as a temporary situation. What I would like to see is the food industry taking its responsibility more seriously and selling us healthier foods, which would be sufficiently fortified and formulated so that our public health improved and supplementation was no longer necessary. This is where I would like to get to. So this is, as I said, this is Barry Popkin's original work, but many other people have joined him. His collaborators are too numerous to list. But in every country that abandons traditional diet and moves to a modern ultra-processed diet, public health deteriorates, and it has deteriorated alarmingly and alarmingly quickly. So the non-communicable disease in general have increased up to 10-fold, and the age of onset of many of these conditions has fallen by 10 to 15 years. Health expectancy is falling all over the world. And of course, when that falls enough, life expectancy starts to fall as well. And it has been falling for the last 4 years or so in the United States, in North America in general, the last 3 in the UK. And we are seeing vulnerable groups demonstrating this same pattern in many other parts of the world now. And the conclusion, the only conclusion that you can draw from this is that populations today are being poisoned by the modern diet. And it's difficult to say no. And Colin, this is something that you touched on. Why on earth would we tear ourselves away from the modern ultra-processed diet when it's so damn delicious? And, you know, this kind of stuff is sold to your kids, it's promoted to your kids, and they want it, they get used to eating it. And as they grow, they maintain their sweet tooth, and they want to keep on eating this kind of toxic, delicious rubbish. And it's designed so carefully, using bliss point technology, which perhaps I'll talk about a little bit, that these foods have become very, very close to being addictive. Now, bliss point technology is a very interesting technology that is used by these food companies to design their foods. And it's an evolutionary step on from the system that used to be used, where you take different samples and feed them to a panel, and then you take a notebook and record their responses. But as we've learned from Dr. Gregory House, everybody lies. People do lie, they're forgetful, they're biased. You can't really trust their responses to these types of questionnaires. So the food industry gets around that by putting you in a scanner, putting your head in an MRI scanner, and then looking at activity in the pleasure centers in your brain while feeding you different types of food. And by doing that, they can juggle the quantities of salt and sugar and fat, and those are some of the 3 components that are very involved, and texture is another, until you reach the so-called bliss point. That is the combination of those factors that creates the highest pleasurable response. That's the bliss point, and that is enabling the food companies to produce foods that hit us so hard, that we find so delicious, that they are more or less addictive. And that shows through in confectionery. These are all highly ultra-processed foods, all highly toxic, not in the short term, but they are if you consume them large amounts for long periods of time. And that applies to a diet like this, not necessarily because of what it contains, but because of what it doesn't contain. This is, for example, extremely low in omega-3s, prebiotic fibers, phytonutrients, to name but a few. And if you're not keen on hamburgers, well, chicken nuggets are, if possible, even worse. And I travel very widely. I've been to every continent, and everywhere I go, I'm always interested in finding out what people eat. America is particularly badly affected. The American diet is so bad that you can actually see, when you look at what people put into their trolleys in supermarkets, when you go to the fast food restaurants, you can see exactly what it is that's sickening them. And I can predict what they're going to die, what they're going to die of. In fact, when you look at a diet like this, you can see what's missing, and you get a very accurate idea as to what pathology is going to overcome them in the largest numbers. And you find, these terrible situations now. And again, I'm digressing perhaps, but in small town America, where all that's left, these towns, these communities that have been absolutely hollowed out by the casino capitalism that's practiced in so many countries now, that all you have left, you've got the shops like Walmart's, Sam's, and Costco's selling these types of foods, and the other big industry is the hospital, because so many people are so very sick. And then perhaps the towns that are doing really well might have a penitentiary as well. So all these foods are very delicious. You love to eat them. They've been designed to be like that. Here's another ultra-processed food, all calories all the time, no nutritional value whatsoever. These are the ultra-processed foods that are poisoning you, either directly because of some of the constituents, which are really quite nasty that they contain, but mostly by omission, because of all the nutrients that you need and that have been stripped out of these types of foods. And this has been reflected in the work of another group of researchers who have come up with this concept called NOVA, the NOVA classification of ultra-processed foods. And the working definition, it's very messy. Some countries have tried systems of traffic lights, that they don't work very well. But the NOVA definition, I think, is probably the best available, or the least worst. And it includes things like, well, can you, when you look at a food, recognize what's in it? And if you can't, well, that's probably ultra-processed. If it has 6 ingredients or more, it's probably ultra-processed. If on the nutritional label at the back of the package, you see things like acidifiers, emulsifiers, then that's probably an ultra-processed food as well. And when you crunch the numbers, and there's researchers all over the world who are doing this, what you find is that the more of these ultra-processed foods you eat, the more you die, the more you're likely to develop diabetes, heart disease, cancer, neurodegenerative conditions. This illustrates, and once again, coming from a slightly different direction, how very toxic these delicious and addictive and omnipresent foods are. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty. How exactly has our diet changed? Well, when you look at the pictures, it all seems obvious, but these are some of the things that have been taken away from our diet. So the omega-3, highly unsaturated fatty acids, and the polyphenols, and these are 2 of the most important anti-inflammatory or protective nutrients that you find in a pre-transitional diet. They are gone. The prebiotics and various other fibers have gone, which means that you now have dysbiosis and more chronic inflammation in the intestines. So the prebiotics you can think of as another very important anti-inflammatory compound. The 1316 beta-glucans have gone. They were present in almost all foods as a result of trace contamination. And because the food production chain has been closed up, they've been largely removed. And that means that your innate immune system isn't working properly. One reason why we are less able to resist infection than we were 2 generations ago, and also why there is so much allergy. Glucosinolates have gone. These are compounds that you would derive from plant sources such as brassica vegetables, and they're absolutely essential for the functioning of lactoperoxidase, which is a very, very interesting and very important enzyme. It's a humoral component in the innate immune system. So this also damages and degrades our ability to resist infection. And the phytonutrients in general, and these have so many different protective capabilities in the brain, in the heart, in our tissues in general. All of this is gone. We have become extremely vulnerable, very, very exposed. And to complicate the situation, what the food industry puts into these ultra-processed foods is huge amounts of sugar and huge amounts of omega-6 fatty acids. In fact, these are the 2 single dietary constituents that have increased more than any other. And these are empty calories, of course. So increased linoleic acid, increased arachidonic acid, and your omega-3s are down, so more chronic inflammatory stress. It's one component that leads to that. And this is a platform which drives chronic inflammatory stress. It drives type B malnutrition, and it creates inflammation in various tissues. And because these foods are so full of sodium, that tends to make matters worse because you're increasing smooth muscle contractility, whether it's in the cardiovascular system or the genitourinary tract or anywhere else, or in the lungs, whatever's going on, that tends to make it worse. And these foods, because they tend to be made in large quantities and very rapidly, and the companies involved are trying to make them economically, they are using rather high temperatures, higher than you would routinely find at home. So things like spray drying techniques are very common. And this leads to the production of advanced glycation end products, advanced lipo oxidation products, and they are highly pro-inflammatory. So a lot of anti-inflammatory protective compounds have gone. They're being replaced by pro-inflammatory compounds. So now you can begin to see why chronic inflammatory stress is so prevalent in modern societies. And this new modern diet also exposes us to very high levels of lipopolysaccharide, not just because the microbiome is becoming distorted, but because of the way in which vegetables are now being sold in pillow packs. If you cut up vegetables and sell them in pieces and you seal them in a pack and put them in the fridge, under those conditions, you get the slow growth of gram-negative microorganisms, which are covered in lipopolysaccharides. So when you eat those foods, and if you pick them fresh, they're absolutely healthy. But if you're using what is called minimal vegetable processing, and you're buying ready-made salads or pieces of vegetables and fruits that are packaged up for you, you're consuming larger and larger amounts of lipopolysaccharide, which is, as I said before, extremely pro-inflammatory. So this is a configuration which is going to cause chronic inflammatory stress, type B malnutrition, dysbiosis, and then because of this huge amount of sugar and our low levels of physical activity, you've got hyperglycemia, hyperinsulinemia, and all the consequent problems from that feeding into it as well. So these are the four horsemen of the nutritional apocalypse. This is enough to explain why our public health is so terrible, why it has become so bad, and why, as our consumption of these ultra-processed foods continues to increase, our public health is suffering even more badly. This creates a profoundly sick society. We're seeing a huge acceleration of the aging process, and other researchers have showed this very, very beautifully. We're seeing far more disease in the middle-aged and elderly. It is not natural for middle-aged and elderly people to sicken progressively as much as we see around us today. And I go back to the hunter-gatherer societies, I go back to the blue zones. And we're seeing more disease in the newborn because there's a whole raft of information now which is saying, well, this problem that we see with the neurodevelopmental diseases, autism, Asperger's, ADD, ADHD, dysphasia, dyspraxia, this whole constellation of disorders has been increasing very dramatically. And some quite recent research has shown, I think unequivocally, that this is due to the brain developing in utero. It's a hugely complex process of this self-wiring, which is based on a series of chemical signals telling the nerves where to go, which connections to form, which connections to prune. And that is very, very badly affected by an inflammatory environment. And so the mothers who are eating this inflammatory diet, living in an inflammatory environment, exposed to social stresses, all of this contributes to an inflammatory environment in the uterus. And this has been linked now, I think, with 100% certainty to these problems, these neurodevelopmental problems. And you know, I think everybody's used to the idea now that when you're pregnant, you should take folic acid. That is just a straw in the wind. We need to pay far more attention to nutrition during pregnancy and maternal nutrition in general if we want to make an impact on this area. More disease in children, asthma, the allergic diseases, that feeds back to those 1,3,1,6 beta-glucans, a pro-inflammatory diet, falling IQ and fertility. Well, I think this is, again, really alarming stuff. There's all sorts of data showing that our brains are being adversely affected, that we're not as intelligent as we used to be. We're certainly not as fertile. Male and female infertility is spiraling, as are our healthcare costs. And ask any med-economist today where they think this is going, and they will say, well, healthcare costs are increasing, and in the background, our macroeconomic indices are going nowhere but down. We're in a death cross. We're at the point where we simply will not be able to afford to continue to meet these increasing healthcare costs. And healthcare systems all over the world are running out of funds. This is great for industry. Food industry is booming. The pharmaceutical industry is booming. But for us, very, very bad news. We're sickening and dying. Our babies are being damaged. And the doctors, the medical profession, are largely fiddling while Rome burns, because they're still, because of their orientation, trying to treat the symptoms. And they're ignoring the fact that this tidal wave of illness is washing over the land and washing increasingly large tides of the sick and the dying into their surgeries, who they're doing their best to patch up, but they're not addressing the main issue. And this is made worse by the fact that the regulators, who are largely owned by industry, really prevent an open and free discussion about what the science of food actually is telling us. So my final words to you would be, get out of the house, because your house is on fire. Take control of your own health. Don't wait to get sick, and then hand over the control of your health to the, I would say, very limited capacity of a medical profession that still relies almost entirely on pharmaceutical intervention. Tell your friends and your family about it, your experiences, because as you know, at Zinzino, we've developed antidotes to these 4 major causes of disease, and tell the truth. You can tell the truth to your friends and your family, and the regulators can't stop you from doing that. So let me stop the screen share.
I would have been, it would have been naive of me to expect you to end with anything less powerful, Paul. That was fascinating, and really kind of, not even thought inspiring. It's more prompting than that. I'm mindful of time. There is a couple of questions I'd like to pick up that have been submitted that I don't think we've had the opportunity to discuss, or that you covered in that. I think, when you make reference to the Bliss Point technology, that reminds me of a lot of the conversations we were having 10, 15 years ago about the industry's obsession with snackability and the dopamine cycle, and how these things have not just stayed, they've actually proliferated. They've become far more of the driving force to encourage people to eat whether or not they're hungry. That's how you create sales. But looking at this, we do have our hands on some solutions and some really powerful ways to be proactive about this. But if you don't mind, before we conclude on that, because I'd say we've got 3 minutes to spare here. Just one of these questions I'd like to pose to you. It's quite a big question, Paul, but I think you'll appreciate it. In autoimmune diseases, the balance of Th1, cellular immunity, and Th2, humoral immunity, white blood cell function, is in balance. Because of this, it doesn't really matter which side we stimulate with different immunomodulators or even herbs, such is the case with beta-glucan. So one, is it possible to know how it affects the Hashimoto, for example, which is a Th1 dominant disease? So if we can stimulate it with beta-glucans, it increases the imbalance or not? And secondly, what happens if someone has a yeast intolerance?
Okay, well, first of all, if you're yeast intolerant, you're not intolerant of the beta-glucans. What you're intolerant of are the amount of proteins which are present in the yeast cell walls, and they are removed from the 1316 beta-glucan products that we and most other people use. So even if you're yeast allergic or intolerant, you will not have a problem with the 1316 beta-glucans. Secondly, let's differentiate between the allergies and the autoimmune diseases. Very obviously very different things. The allergies are certainly associated with Th1 dominance, and that situation is made worse if you also have a pro-inflammatory internal environment. And those are things that we can address easily and very successfully. With autoimmune disease, I think that the beta-glucans don't have very much of an impact here at all. And I happen to know this because I was, for many years, the chair of one of the scientific advisory boards to Biothera, which was the industry leader in this whole area of research. And we know that in people who, or in animal models of autoimmune disease, the beta-glucans didn't seem to do anything at all. They weren't helpful, they weren't harmful. I can say from my own personal experience that there is another way to address this issue of autoimmune disease. Now, with autoimmune disease, the damage to the target tissue is being mediated through chronic inflammatory stress. That's how you end up damaging the thyroid or the articular tissues, or whichever other part, or the beta cells in the islands of Langerhans. It depends, whatever the autoimmune disease is. This is being mediated by the immune system, creating chronic inflammatory stress in and around that tissue that it perhaps recognizes as non-self, although there's a huge debate that's going on about that as well. And therefore, theoretically, it would be a good idea to reduce chronic inflammatory stress in such cases. And in fact, the medical profession routinely treats autoimmune disease with immunosuppressants, which are so crude and so toxic that they come with a whole raft of adverse effects, and they're not really very good to use long term. Speaking from personal experience, I was diagnosed with Graves about 15 years ago now, a long time ago, and I treated myself with a forerunner, a precursor of balance oil, large amounts of fish oil and olive oil, which I drank together, and it was absolutely appalling. But I did succeed in bringing the chronic inflammation under control and kept it under control for several months. And after that time, I gradually eased up because I wanted to know what was going on. And at the end of it, it turned out that my immune system had forgotten its target. So now I'm euthyroid 12, 13 years down the road. My doctors say, oh, sometimes this happens. They've never seen a case like that. But I'm pretty certain I know what did it. And I'm now hearing from other people who are using the same approach. The immune system, I think, can be helped to forget its target. If its attack is blunted for long enough, I think it begins to think, well, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. We should be doing something else instead. But again, I don't think that's the whole answer, because there's increasing evidence that this whole concept of autoimmunity may be a bit of a mistake anyway. And what the immune system might actually be doing is reacting to intracellular pathogens. And it's their debris that's being expressed on the cell membranes in those target tissues that the immune system is actually reacting to. And there's different strands of evidence that support that. I've written about that in my blog, because I think this is a fascinating area. And if you go to my blog, which is drpaulclayton.eu, and type in "the bug is a feature," and there's several posts under that heading. And I've written about this because I find it so fascinating, and people might find that useful.
I'm sure they will. And as I expected, in that one response, Paul, you've answered about 8 other questions that were in line with that. So thank you very much. We are past the hour, folks, and this has been absolutely incredible and insightful and thought-provoking. And I guess I'll leave it to you, Paul, if you don't mind. I'm going to let you conclude. I want to thank everybody for attending, for contributing, for asking questions, for listening, for being here, to trying to facilitate change in your communities amongst the people that you can be in direct contact with. That's how we make this happen. Paul's gone into a testimony of his own experience there, and people like to dismiss that. But the old Huntsfeld quote from 1954 is anecdote on its own is worthless, but when you collect them together, it becomes evidence. And that's what we need to do. We need to collect more of that so we reach a critical mass. But I'm going to let the final word, and therefore the final impact, be yours, Paul. What would you like to conclude with?
You're right. Case histories are the lowest level of evidence, and I perhaps shouldn't have talked about my own situation. It's of limited interest. But you said that I was being provocative and passionate, and I think I would say, yes, I'm guilty. I'm guilty of those charges. I am angry. I'm angry at what I see as so much unnecessary loss of health and loss of life. I'm angry at a system that not only allows, but encourages this to happen. I want to change the way in which healthcare is delivered. I think the pharmaceutical companies who call themselves laughably the ethical industry, they are anything but ethical if you look at their past behavior, are not the answer to the problems that we have today. The food industry could be, if we could bring them on board and persuade them to act in a more responsible manner. But in the meantime, I have many medical heroes. Pasteur is one of them, Bernard is another, but a third, and I got to pick 20, is John Snow. You know, not for those English people, not that popinjay newsreader. I'm referring to John Snow, the father of epidemiology. And he was the man, this was back in a time when London didn't really have adequate sanitation. London was repeatedly hit by waves of waterborne infections, so typhoid, typhus, and cholera. And these were major causes of illness and death. And the doctors of the day were prancing around, bleeding, purging, killing their patients. And what Snow did, he stepped back and he drew on a map where each of these cases was being reported. And he realized, once he'd done that, that they all centered around one particular contaminated well. So while the other doctors were just making fools of themselves, John Snow went down to the well and famously he took the handle off the pump, and within 48 hours, the plague had stopped. I'm not a John Snow, but I'm walking in his giant footsteps. And I look at public health from a similar perspective. I love spending my time in the databases, on the campus, in laboratories and universities. I mean, that's all grist to the mill. And I love the opportunity to talk to other scientists, to find out what's going on. And you know how much I network. You know, you see that, I think, in my blog. But at the end of the day, the theory is wonderful, the science is wonderful, but we must distill that into practice. I think that we have a responsibility to others. We have a responsibility to try, as we pass through this world, and it's a very short passage, to try and help to make things better. So I am profoundly motivated to take this information and to distill it into useful and usable tools that people can use to escape from this prison I described earlier, and to improve their health and improve the health of their families, their friends, their communities. The industry won't do it. It's up to us.
Superb. In fact, I'm tempted to put a cap on just so that I can doff my cap to you, Paul, for that kind of comment. Superb. Round of applause, and I'm sure I can see there's literally the messages of thanks are pouring through, and what a way to end. Thank you very much, Paul. Outstanding, illuminating, fascinating, and yeah, provocative, but I believe provocative in exactly the right way. I think what you've delivered today is a call to arms, and a very much needed one. We're going to end there, folks. We're going to wrap it up. We will be back with you in July the 15th, I believe, times to be confirmed, where we'll bring an even newer member of scientific staff from Zinzino to the front, which is Emily Gislovic, who is exceptional, and I will say no more until you all have the opportunity to meet her, but she's truly exceptional. I look forward to chatting to Emily on the 15th, and I hope that you can all meet us there. Until then, stay well, keep at it. Thanks again, Paul, absolutely outstanding. Thank you for your time and sharing your wisdom, and we'll see you all soon. All the best.